Welcome to the Ponderings podcast. I'm your host, Milo. In this podcast, I'll be introducing Maurice Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception. Merleau-Ponty is a French interdisciplinary philosopher who contributed to both existential and phenomenological schools of thought in the early 20th century. He not only did philosophy, but also studied and wrote about anthropology, Gestalt psychology, politics, neurology, and history. He conducted case studies on visual illusions, visual arts, and clinical cases. As a result, he grounded his philosophy with empirical work and used his philosophy to explain his empirical findings. So what is phenomenology? Phenomenology is the philosophical method that studies the development of human consciousness and self-awareness. Its primary concern is in the phenomena as perceived by the individual's lived experiences. This method includes analyzing the possibility of intentionality, conditions that involve sensory-motor skills, and the background of environmental and social practices. It is the examination of one's subjective phenomenal experience. Phenomenology focuses on the way we perceive, act, and cognize in the world. It not only encompasses subjective experience of an individual, but also how perception occurs and configures our experience as human beings. Humans have a distinct phenomenological experience from other creatures. That being said, how one experiences phenomena also dictates the significance of the experienced phenomena. Signification here is analogous to that which is given meaning, or what an object symbolizes for us. The significance that we place onto our phenomenal experience differs from the significations placed by other creatures, animals, plants, etc., because of our distinct way of experiencing and interacting with phenomena. Merleau-Ponty is highly influenced by both phenomenologists Edmund Husserl and Heidegger, as well as Gestalt psychologists. The type of phenomenology that Merleau-Ponty focuses on is primarily concerned with perception, action, and cognition. Husserl and Heidegger did not mention the body as a vital aspect to how we experience phenomena, which differentiates Merleau-Ponty from these previous phenomenologists. Merleau-Ponty makes sure to include the body as a central component to his phenomenology. The phenomenological approach was first introduced by the philosopher Edmund Husserl in the 1890s. He proposed that we see more than meets the eye, and that we are able to see objects as three-dimensional, even though we cannot perceive their backside or through them. For Husserl, these three-dimensional structures are perceived as the horizon of our perception, which stands for the background of meaning in which objects are situated in. The horizon is what makes the perceptual act of an individual object available and meaningful for us. Husserl's phenomenology thus focuses heavily on visual and auditory perception to describe the background and foreground of our perceptual experience of phenomena. Martin Heidegger, a student of Edmund Husserl, took Husserl's phenomenology further to encompass active involvement and goal-driven acts. Heidegger claimed that act grips was the fundamental state of being for the kinds of creatures we are, and termed this being in the world. Merleau-Ponty builds on this term, being in the world, by grounding perception into its vital connection with the body. The body is how we are able to perceive and be in the world. The Phenomenology of Perception is Merleau-Ponty's most well-known phenomenological work. In this, he applied an interdisciplinary lens to his phenomenology, drawing from contemporary research in Gestalt theory, psychology, and neurology. He touches on topics ranging from perceptual experience to sexuality, language, space, nature, intersubjectivity, time, and freedom. He lays out the arguments of both empiricist and idealist or intellectualist schools of thought when it comes to perception. He then develops a third way of explaining perception which avoids the problematic assumptions that arise in idealism and empiricism. Specifically, the assumption that the objective world exists as a ready-made and full actualized reality. His first critique starts with empiricism's sensationalist view of perception and the Constancy Hypothesis. The sensationist view of perception asserts that Experience as a sort of knowledge is only available through the sensations or sense perceptions. Sensation is viewed as resulting from determinate atoms rather than meaningful wholes. The Constancy Hypothesis states that there is a constant point-for-point correspondence between physical aspects of a stimulus, sensation, and the psychological attribute that results from the sensation. Local sense qualities are not as directly correlated to the psychological result. For instance, a gray circle can appear bluish depending on the colors surrounding it. It is not a point-to-point constancy of stimulus to representation, but rather, as Merleau-Ponty states, perception has more to do with the context and relations that are relevant to the stimulus complex. Perception is relationally determined rather than just atomically determined. Empiricism, thus, fails to acknowledge the indeterminacies, ambiguities, and contextual relations that are unaccounted for by the Constancy Hypothesis. Intellectualism fails to do the same thing as well. It falls into a similar trap in that it results in the determinate atoms as cause for perception. Idealists propose that the reality we perceive is a projection from the mind, a representational view of perception. Both intellectualism and empiricism are concerned with how we come to know what we are perceiving. Merleau-Ponty asserts that perceptual experience should focus on the gestalt, which takes into account the whole of the figures against the ground and accounts for the indeterminate and ambiguous contextual aspects found in our phenomenal experience. He believes that the way we should approach perception is not on how it gives us knowledge, but rather on how it is sensed. Sensing is, quote, the living communication with the world that makes it present to us as a familiar place of our life, unquote. The perceived world is imbued with meanings and values that directly relate to our lived bodies. The lived body is a term Merleau-Ponty describes as, quote, one's body or one's point of reference in the world, unquote. We are embodied creatures that are situated in the environment. Space and time occur because we have a reference point that gives us the ability to perceive depth, or a horizon, as Husserl terms it. Similarly, time exists because, quote, the body takes possession of time and makes a past and a future exist for a present. It is not a thing suffering time, but rather our embodied point of reference creates time, unquote. The way we experience the world is essentially a motor intentionality, that is, grounded in our bodily abilities as well as a situated environment. Perception is a bodily process, and subsequently, the kind of creature we are is necessarily embodied. Embodiment for Merleau-Ponty includes anything to do with perception, language, background knowledge, and consciousness. Perception and action are not distinct, but rather are the same thing. We perceive with our bodies, we are conscious with our bodies, and we experience things in the first person. Action is a combination of our bodily ability to perceive the environment, space and time, and subjective will to initiate movement. So in contrast to an empirical sensationist view of perception, Merleau-Ponty claims perception is not sensory stimulation alone, but rather it is a bodily being in the world of action possibilities. The way we perceive space and time has all to do with how our bodies perceive and enact time. We can only perceive what is affordable or available to us for the possibility of engagement with the world. A world of action possibilities is one that is a pre-configured schema for interacting with the world based on our body. For instance, birds are going to interact with their environment differently based on how their bodies are built and what is afforded to them. We interact with our environment in a way that is accessible and available for us in our bodily perception. Merleau-Ponty influenced ecological psychology, which uses the term affordances to illustrate how bodily perception enacts our experiences in the world. Affordances are environmental opportunities for action, and are objective features of the environment. A cup is an affordance to a human because we can use the cup to hold water or food. In contrast, a cup would seem rather useless to a cat. as a tool for food. Instead, the cat would probably just knock it over. Another example is carpet. For humans, carpet is decorative as a warm flooring when one is barefoot. For the cat, the carpet could serve as a warm, comfortable bed, as well as an object to potentially sharpen their claws with or destroy. Affordances are relative to the behavioral abilities of the animals that perceive them. Merleau-Ponty proposes that we do not have perceptions, nor do we perceive objects as separate substances existing beside other objects. Rather, perception is, quote, a flow of experience that implicate and explicate each other, just as much in simultaneity as they do in succession, unquote. Perception is ambiguous in that it is composed of relevant figures of a part of a background of other relevant figures. An initial perception cannot be abstracted from the entirety of the perceived whole. Our perceptual experiences emerge simultaneously and all at once. Every perceptual instance presupposes a history of the subject and then envelops the subject in its encounter with the object. This is considered a lived space as opposed to the term lived body. A lived space is the experience of spatiality of that which expresses our being firmly set within the world. This lived space can include not only that which is our current experiential landscape, but also mythical and abstract spaces. He categorizes the mythical phenomenon as a genuine presence rather than a mere representation. What we perceive, we in turn create meaning from. Merleau-Ponty believes that myth, quote, is a projection of existence and an expression of the human condition, unquote. These lived spaces are constructed on natural environmental spaces, but their human significations are expressed and envelop the objects when they are presented to us. Anthropological spaces are filled with human significance, but are not the only spaces we inhabit. We are always rooted in a natural non-human space, such that we can lose our gaze on a point in the wall and realize that all that remains is, quote, a play of light on indefinite matter, unquote. Our perceptions are not always built into these analytical perceptions, but we have the ability to inhabit these types of lived spaces. Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological approach combined Husserl and Heidegger's most important insights: the establishment of a figure against a background horizon, and the fact that we are a being in the world at grips with tools that are available and ready to be skillfully used. He integrated these insights and went further to acknowledge our necessarily embodied state. To perceive is to be a body that has the ability to perceive and skillfully engage with its situated environment. This was a very brief introduction to the phenomenology of Merleau-Ponty. I hope I was able to clarify some of the key points in his phenomenology. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned.